The stories you're about to hear come from England in the late 1300s, a time when life was hard, short, and often ended in unexpected ways. They are based on real coroners' rolls, official records made when people died suddenly or suspiciously. The clerks who recorded them weren't trying to tell stories. They were simply writing the facts quickly and briefly as they could, then move on. To make those statements come alive, I filled in context, character, and reasonable detail. The result is storytelling, rooted in real events, shaped from the truth, and fully possible as told. The Sand Gatherer of Cam. A story from Gloucestershire, late autumn, 1396. If you stood on the higher ground above Cam on a clear day, you could see the land spread out in practical, working layers, fields stitched with hedges, a ribbon of road, the dark line of the forest of Dean. People in Gloucestershire didn't talk about industry the way we do now, but they lived inside it. The county's iron trade fed whole networks of metalworkers, smiths, cutlers, bladesmiths, turning ore, charcoal, and sweat into nails, horseshoes, tools, and household goods that everybody relied on. If you were poor, and unfortunately most people were, you were part of that commerce, whether you wanted to be or not. William Batchelor was part of it. William was around 30 years old, which in those days meant he was young enough to work hard and old enough to make smart decisions. He wasn't a lord, and he wasn't a scholar. And he wasn't one of those men who could afford to spend an afternoon arguing about politics over warm ale. He was a sand gatherer. It was not a glamorous trade, not the kind anyone wrote songs about, but it was very necessary. Sand was used in building, mixing, and smithing, especially in cities where iron and metalwork were being produced. William's job was simple in description and brutal in practice. Shovel, lift, fill sacks, load carts, deliver. And he delivered most of it to a local blacksmith. One of those men who always smelled like smoke and hot metal, and who could fix a hinge or a horseshoe with the same calm certainty. The smith didn't always pay in coins. Often he paid in the way medieval people commonly did when doing business. They were paid with food, a house to rent, or perhaps a worn cloak. The kind of payment that kept you alive, but never let you get ahead. William didn't complain about that part. Not much, anyway. No, William's problem wasn't the work. William's problem was William. He had that special kind of confidence that doesn't come from being right. It comes from being stubborn long enough that people stop correcting you. He had the talent, if you can call it that, of turning ordinary decisions into personal crusades. Your horse would not tire as easily if you had lighter loads, someone would tell him, and William would take it as an insult, not a suggestion, but an accusation. So he doubled down and increased the amount of sand in his cart, just to prove a point no one had made. That week late autumn, when daylight felt short and the wind had teeth, the village had been talking about the coming feast of St. Leonard. St. Leonard's feast day was the 6th of November, a date that mattered mostly because it was a day of prayer for those who felt trapped or bound to their work. A day when people hoped the saint might hear their pleas, break their chains, or deliver some unexpected turn of fortune. That Friday began like most of them. The air was damp, clouds hung low, and the weather was unusually warm. William rose early, wrapped himself in whatever wool he owned, harnessed his horse to the cart, and headed toward the sandpit, a gouged place in the earth that sat near a field not far from Cam. There were no regulations. Anyone could collect sand from the pit, and people had done so for generations. There was only one rule that everyone understood. Be careful around the over-collected cliff faces. Collapses did happen, and frequently. This rule had been passed from mouth to mouth in the practical language of people who couldn't afford preventable mistakes. By midday, he had already made several trips delivering sand, His horse was pulling well, the cart gave him no trouble, and the day had been productive. As he headed back toward the pit, he noticed clouds racing overhead and tree branches bending sharply in the rising wind. He urged the reluctant horse into a quicker pace, but the wind kept up with him, and by the time he arrived, it had grown louder and more insistent, rattling bare branches and sending grit skittering across the ground. People passed him with their carts, warning him to leave. William refused to listen. He had already made up his mind, and the weather was not going to stop him. As he pulled the cart into the pit, he decided the quickest way to fill his cart would be right up against the tallest sandbank in the pit, which also formed into a large overhang. The wind slapped at his cloak and stung his cheeks with sand, but under the overhang, it was quieter, like a crude shelter carved by chance. He stepped beneath it. He was suddenly tired, like a wave of fatigue that completely washed over him. He pulled out some coarse bread and a hard bit of cheese and began to eat. The last of the departing sand gatherers shouted their warnings as they passed him, but William wouldn't hear it. He shook his head, waved them off, and returned their concern with rude remarks, telling them to mind their own business. The sand above him formed a shelf, an overhanging bank that looked solid enough if you didn't think too hard about how sand works. It doesn't brace like wood. It holds, and then it doesn't. William leaned back and told himself he'd rest for only a moment. He was tired, and by all means he had earned a good rest. He could hear the wind blowing outside his pocket of calm, and the contrast felt comforting, like hiding inside his own sheltered space. His eyelids grew heavy, and his breathing slowed. The storm made the air vibrate. The bank, already weakened by digging, sat there under its own weight, waiting for the exact wrong moment. That moment came suddenly and dramatically. The overhanging shelf failed. Sand doesn't fall like a stone. It pours. It rushes. It wraps around you as it drops, filling space, pressing down, stealing air. 1 second, William was asleep under a shelter he had chosen with pride. The next, he was buried beneath tons and tons of sand. By the time the wind eased, the sandpit looked ordinary again, just a scar in the earth, slightly reshaped. No sign of drama, no sign of the decision made beneath it. Hours later, when the winds had died down and the pit was once again alive with movement, a lone horse and cart were found next to the newly formed pile of sand, standing alone, resting as if bored and patiently waiting to go back to its stable. People began to ask questions. After a full day of digging, a man named Henry Allport became the first finder of William Batchelor's body. When viewed by the coroner and examined by 12 jurors from Wick, Cam, and Slimbridge, they swore by what they believed had happened. They said William had been sitting, asleep in a sandpit beneath an overhanging bank, when the bank suddenly fell upon him and crushed him beneath the sand. William died because he chose the worst possible place to rest, even though he had better options, and even though everyone else told him it was a bad idea. And the only thing more predictable than the sand falling was William insisting, right up until his untimely end, that everyone else should mind their own business.